House of Light by Mary Oliver. Published in 1990. For Molly Malone Cook. Some questions you might ask. Is the soul solid like iron, or is it tender and breakable like the wings of a moth in the beak of the owl? Who has it and who doesn't? I keep looking around me. The face of the moose is as sad as the face of Jesus. The swan opens her white wings slowly. In the fall, the black bear carries leaves into the darkness. One question leads to another. Does it have a shape, like an iceberg, like the eye of a hummingbird? Does it have one lung, like the snake and the scallop? Why should I have it, and not the anteater who loves her children? Why should I have it, and not the camel? Come to think of it, what about the maple trees? What about the blue iris? What about all the little stones sitting alone in the moonlight? What about roses and lemons and their shining leaves? What about the grass? Moccasin Flowers. All my life, so far, I have loved more than one thing, including the mossy hooves of dreams, including the spongy litter under the tall trees. In spring, the moccasin flowers reach for the crackling lick of the sun and burn down. Sometimes in the shadows, I see the hazy eyes, the lamb lips of oblivion, its deep drowse, and I can imagine a new nothing in the universe, the matted leaves splitting open, revealing the black planks of the stairs. But all my life, so far, I have loved best how the flowers rise and open, how the pink lungs of their bodies enter the fire of the world and stand there shining and willing, the one thing they can do before they shuffle forward into the floor of darkness. They become the trees. The Buddha's last instruction. Make of yourself a light, said the Buddha before he died. I think of this every morning as the east begins to tear off its many clouds of darkness to send up the first signal, a white fan streaked with pink and violet, even green. An old man, he lay down between two solid trees, and he might have said anything, knowing it was his final hour. The light burns upward, it thickens and settles over the fields. Around him, the villagers gathered and stretch forward to listen. Even before the sun itself hangs, disattached in the blue air, I am touched everywhere by its ocean of yellow waves. No doubt he thought of everything that had happened in his difficult life. And then I feel the sun itself as it blazes over the hills like a million flowers on fire. Clearly, I'm not needed, yet I feel myself turning into something of inexplicable value. Slowly, beneath the branches, he raised his head. He looked into the faces of that frightened crowd. Spring. Somewhere, a black bear has just risen from sleep and is staring down the mountain. All night, in the brisk and shallow restlessness of early spring, I think of her. Her 4 black fists flicking the gravel, her tongue like a red fire touching the grass, the cold water. There is only one question: how to love this world. I think of her rising like a black and leafy ledge to sharpen her claws against the silence of the trees. Whatever else my life is, with its poems and its music and its glass cities, it is also this dazzling darkness coming down the mountain, breathing and tasting. All day I think of her white teeth, her wordlessness, her perfect love. Singapore. In Singapore, in the airport, a darkness was ripped from my eyes. In the women's restroom, one compartment stood open. A woman knelt there, washing something in the white bowl. Disgust argued in my stomach, and I felt in my pocket for my ticket. A poem should always have birds in it. Kingfishers say with their bold eyes and gaudy wings. Rivers are pleasant, and of course trees. A waterfall, or if that's not possible, a fountain rising and falling. A person wants to stand in a happy place, in a poem. When the woman turned, I could not answer her face. Her beauty and her embarrassment struggled together, and neither could win. She smiled, and I smiled. What kind of nonsense is this? Everybody needs a job. Yes, a person wants to stand in a happy place in a poem. But first we must watch her as she stares down at her labor, which is dull enough. She is washing the tops of the airport ashtrays as big as hub caps with a blue rag. Her small hands turn the metal, scrubbing and rinsing. She does not work slowly nor quickly, but like a river. Her dark hair is like the wing of a bird. I don't doubt for a moment that she loves her life, and I want her to rise up from the crust and the slop and fly down to the river. This probably won't happen, but maybe it will. If the world were only pain and logic, who would want it? Of course, it isn't. Neither do I mean anything miraculous, but only the light that can shine out of a life. I mean the way she unfolded and refolded the blue cloth, the way her smile was only for my sake. I mean the way this poem is filled with trees and birds. Wow. The Hermit Crab. Once I looked inside the darkness of a shell folded like a pastry, and there was a fancy face, or almost a face. It turned away and frisked up its brawny forearms so quickly against the light and my looking in, I scarcely had time to see it gleaming under the pure white roof of old calcium. When I set it down, it hurried along the tide line of the sea, which was slashing along as usual, shouting and hissing toward the future, turning its back with every tide on the past, leaving the shore littered every morning with more ornaments of death. What a pearly rubble from which to choose a house like a white flower, and what a rebellion to leap into it and hold on, connecting everything. The past to the future, which is of course the miracle, which is the only argument there is against the sea. Lilies. I have been thinking about living like the lilies that blow in the fields. They rise and fall in the wedge of the wind and have no shelter from the tongues of the cattle, and have no closets or cupboards and have no legs. Still, I would like to be as wonderful as that old idea. But if I were a lily, I think I would wait all day for the green face of the hummingbird to touch me. What I mean is, could I forget myself even in those feathery fields? When Van Gogh preached to the poor, of course he wanted to save someone, most of all himself. He wasn't a lily, and wandering through the bright fields only gave him more ideas it would take his life to solve. I think I will always be lonely in this world where the cattle graze like a black and white river, where the ravishing lilies melt without protest on their tongues, where the hummingbird, whenever there is a fuss, just rises and floats away. Wings. I saw the heron poise like a branch of white petals in the swamp. in the mud that lies like a glaze, in the water that swirls its pale panels of reflected clouds. I saw the heron shaking its damp wings, and then I felt an explosion, a pain, also a happiness I can hardly mention, as I slid free, as I saw the world through those yellow eyes, as I stood like that rippling under the molted sky of the evening that was beginning to throw its dense shadows. No, said my heart and drew back. But my bones knew something wonderful about the darkness, and they thrashed in their cords. They fought, they wanted to lie down in that silky mash of the swamp the sooner to fly. The swan. Across the wide waters something comes floating, a slim and delicate ship filled with white flowers, and it moves on its miraculous muscles as though time didn't exist, as though bringing such gifts to the dry shore was a happiness almost beyond bearing. And now it turns its dark eyes, it rearranges the clouds of its wings, it trails an elaborate webbed foot the color of charcoal. Soon it will be here. Oh, what shall I do when that poppy-colored beak rests in my hand? Said Mrs. Blake of the poet. I miss my husband's company. He is so often in paradise. Of course, the path to heaven doesn't lie down in flat miles. It's in the imagination with which you perceive this world, and the gestures with which you honor it. Oh, what will I do? What will I say when those white wings touch the shore? The Kingfisher. The kingfisher rises out of the black wave like a blue flower. In his beak, he carries a silver leaf. I think this is the prettiest world, so long as you don't mind a little dying. How could there be a day in your whole life that doesn't have its splash of happiness? There are more fish than there are leaves on 1,000 trees, and anyway, the kingfisher wasn't born to think about it, or anything else. When the wave snaps shut over his blue head, the water remains water. Hunger is the only story he has ever heard in his life that he could believe. I don't say he's right, neither do I say he's wrong. Religiously, he swallows the silver leaf with its broken red river, and with a rough and easy cry I couldn't rouse out of my thoughtful body if my life depended on it. He swings back over the bright sea to do the same thing, to do it, as I long to do something, anything, perfectly. Indonesia. On the curving, dusty roads we drove through the plantations, where the pickers balanced on the hot hillsides. Then we climbed toward the green trees, toward the white scarves of the clouds, to the inn that is never closed in this island of fairest weather. The sun hung like a stone. Time dripped away like a steaming river, and from somewhere a dry tongue lashed out its single motto, now and forever. And the pickers balanced on the hot hillsides like gray and blue blossoms, wrapped in their heavy layer of clothes, against the whips of the branches in that world of leaves no poor man, with a brown face and an empty sack, has ever picked his way out of. At the inn we stepped from the car to the garden, where tea was brought to us scalding in white cups from the fire. Don't ask if it was the fire of honey or the fire of death. Don't ask if we were determined to live at last with merciful hearts. We sat among the unforgettable flowers. We let the white cups cool before we raised them to our lips. This next title is in German, so I apologize if I botch it. Ich bin der Wald abhanden gekommen. Today is Gustav Mahler's birthday, and as usual I went out, early into the sea-green morning where the birds were singing all over, but mostly at the scalloped edges of the pond and in the branches of the trees which flared out and down, like the clothes of our spirits patiently waiting. For hours I wandered over the fields, and the only thing that kept me company was a song. It glided along with my delicious dark happiness, my heavy, bristling, and aching delight at the world which has been like this forever and forever, the leaves, the birds, the ponds, the loneliness, and sometimes from a lifetime ago and another country, such a willing and lilting companion. A song made so obviously for me, at what unknowable cost, and by a stranger. Turtle. Now I see it. It nudges with its bulldog head, the slippery stems of the lilies making them tremble. And now it noses along in the wake of the little brown teal, who is leading her soft children from one side of the pond to the other. She keeps close to the edge, and they follow closely. The good children, the tender children, the sweet children dangling their pretty feet into the darkness. And now will come, I can count on it, the murky splash, the certain victory of that pink and gassy mouth, and the frantic circling of the hen while the rest of the chicks flare away over the water and into the reeds, and my heart will be most mournful on their account. But listen, what's important? Nothing's important except that the great and cruel mystery of the world, of which this is a part, not be denied. Once I happened to see on a city street in summer a dusty, fouled turtle plodding along, a snapper, broken out, I suppose, from some backyard cage, and I knew what I had to do. I looked it right in the eyes and I caught it. I put it like a small mountain range into a knapsack, and I took it out of the city and I let it down into the dark pond, into the cool water and the light of the lilies to live. The deer. You never know. The body of night opens like a river. It drifts upward like white smoke, like so many wrappings of mist. And on the hillside, 2 deer are walking along, just as though this wasn't the owned, tilled earth of today, but the past. I did not see them the next day or the next, but in my mind's eye, there they are in the long grass, like 2 sisters. This is the earnest work. Each of us is given only so many mornings to do it, to look around and love the oily fur of our lives, the hoof and the grass-stained muzzle. Days I don't do this, I feel the terror of idleness like a red thirst. Death isn't just an idea. When we die, the body breaks open like a river. The old body goes on climbing the hill. The loon on Oak Head Pond cries for 3 days in the gray mist, cries for the north it hopes it can find, plunges and comes up with a slapping pickerel, blinks its red eye, cries again. You come every afternoon and wait to hear it. You sit a long time, quiet under the thick pines in the silence that follows, as though it were your own twilight, as though it were your own vanishing song. What is it? Who can say? Is it a snowy egret or a white flower standing at the glossy edge of the lily and frog-filled pond? Hours ago, the orange sun opened the cups of the lilies, and the leopard frogs began kicking their long muscles, breast-stroking like little green dwarfs under the roof of the rich, iron-colored water. Now the soft eggs of the salamander in their wrappings of jelly begin to shiver. They're tired of sleep. They have a new idea. They want to swim away into the world. Who could stop them? Who could tell them to go cautiously, to flow slowly under the lily pads? Off they go, hundreds of them, like the black fingerprints of the rain. The frogs freeze into perfect five-fingered shadows, but suddenly the flower has fire-colored eyes, and one of the shadows vanishes. Clearly now, the flower is a bird. It lifts its head, it lifts the hinges of its snowy wings, tossing a moment of light in every direction like a chandelier, and then once more is still. The salamanders, like tiny birds locked into formation, fly down into the endless mysteries of the transforming water, and how could anyone believe that anything in this world is only what it appears to be? That anything is ever final, that anything, in spite of its absence, ever dies a perfect death. Writing poems. This morning I watched the pale green cones of the rhododendrons open their small pink and red blouses. The bodies of the flowers were instantly beautiful to the bees. They hurried out of that dark place in the thick tree, one after another, an invisible line upon which their iridescence caught fire as the sun caught them sliding down. Is there anything more important than hunger and happiness? Each bee entered the frills of a flower to find the sticky fountain, and if some dust spilled on the walkways of the petals and caught onto their bodies, I don't know if the bees know that otherwise death is everywhere, even in the red swamp of a flower. But they did this with no small amount of desperation, you might say, love. And the flowers, as daft as mud, poured out their honey. Some herons. A blue preacher flew toward the swamp in slow motion. On the leafy banks, an old Chinese poet, hunched in the white gown of his wings, was waiting. The water was the kind of dark silk that has silver lines shot through it when it is touched by the wind, or is splashed upward in a small, quick flower by the life beneath it. The preacher made his difficult landing, his skirts up around his knees. The poet's eyes flared just as a poet's eyes are said to do when the poet is awakened from the forest of meditation. It was summer. It was only a few moments past the sun's rising, which meant that the whole long, sweet day lay before them. They greeted each other, rumpling their gowns for an instant and then smoothing them. They entered the water, and instantly 2 more herons, equally as beautiful, joined them and stood just beneath them in the black, polished water where they fished all day. "5 a.m. in the pine woods. I'd seen their hoof prints in the deep needles and knew they ended the long night under the pines, walking like 2 mute and beautiful women toward the deeper woods, so I got up in the dark and went there. They came slowly down the hill and looked at me sitting under the blue trees. Shyly, they stepped closer and stared from under their thick lashes and even nibbled some damp tassels of weeds. This is not a poem about a dream, though it could be. This is a poem about the world that is ours, or could be. Finally, one of them, I swear it, would have come to my arms, but the other stamped sharp hoof in the pine needles like the tap of sanity, and they went off together through the trees. When I woke, I was alone. I was thinking, so this is how you swim inward. So this is how you flow outward. So this is how you pray. Little owl who lives in the orchard. His beak could open a bottle, and his eyes, when he lifts their soft lids, go on reading something just beyond your shoulder. Blake, maybe, or the Book of Revelation. Never mind that, he eats only the black smocked crickets and dragonflies if they happen to be out laid over the ponds, and of course the occasional festal mouse. Never mind that, he is only a memo from the offices of fear. It's not size but surge that tells us when we're in touch with something real. And when I hear him in the orchard fluttering down the little aluminum ladder of his scream, when I see his wings open like two black ferns, a flurry of palpitations as cold as sleet rackets across the marshlands of my heart like a wild spring day. Somewhere in the universe, in the gallery of important things, the babyish owl, ruffled and rackish, sits on its pedestal. Dear dark dapple of plush, a message reads the label from that mysterious conglomerate, Oblivion & Co. The hooked head stares from its blouse of dark, feathery lace. It could be a valentine. The gift. I wanted to thank the mockingbird for the vigor of his song. Every day he sang from the rim of the field while I picked blueberries or just idled in the sun. Every day he came fluttering by to show me, and why not, the white blossoms in his wings. So one day I went there with a machine and played some songs of Malheur. The mockingbird stopped singing. He came close and seemed to listen. Now when I go down to the field, a little Malheur spills through the sputters of his song. How happy I am, lounging in the light, listening as the music floats by. And I give thanks also for my mind, that thought of giving a gift. And mostly I'm grateful that I take this world so seriously. Pipefish. In the green and purple weeds called Zostera, loosely swinging in the shallows, I waited. I reached my hands in that most human of gestures to find, to see, to hold whatever it is that's there. And what came up wasn't much, but it glittered and struggled. It had eyes and a body like a wand. It had pouting lips. No longer all of it than any of my fingers. It wanted away from my strangeness. It wanted to go back into that waving forest so quick and wet. I forget when this happened, how many years ago I opened my hands like a promise I would keep my whole life and have and let it go. I tell you this in case you have yet to wade into the green and purple shallows where the diminutive pipefish wants to go on living. I tell you this against everything you are, your human heart, your hands passing over the world, gathering and closing, so dry and slow. The kookaburras. In every heart there is a coward and a procrastinator. In every heart there is a god of flowers just waiting to come out of its cloud and lift its wings. The kookaburras, kingfishers, pressed against the edge of their cage, they asked me to open the door. Years later, I wake in the night and remember how I said to them, no, and walked away. They had the brown eyes of soft-hearted dogs. They didn't want to do anything so extraordinary, only to fly home to their river. But now I suppose the great darkness has covered them. As for myself, I am not yet a god of even the palest flowers. Nothing else has changed either. Someone tosses their white bones to the dung heap. The sun shines on the latch of their cage. I lie in the dark, my heart pounding. The lilies break open over the dark water. Inside that mud hive, that gas sponge, that reeking leaf yard, that rippling dream bowl, the leeches flecked and swirling broth of life as rich as Babylon. The fists crack open and the wands of the lilies quicken. They rise like pale poles with their wrapped beaks of lace. One day they tear the surface. The next they break open over the dark water. And there you are on the shore, fitful and thoughtful, trying to attach them to an idea, some news of your own life. But the lilies are slippery and wild. They are devoid of meaning. They are simply doing from the deepest spurs of their being what they are impelled to do every summer, and so, dear sorrow, are you. Death at a Great Distance. The ripe, floating caps of the fly amanita glow in the pine woods. I don't even think of the eventual corruption of my body, but of how quaint and humorous they are, like a collection of doorknobs, half moons, then a yellow drizzle of flying saucers. In any case, they won't hurt me unless I take them between my lips and swallow, which I know enough not to do. Once in the South, I had this happen. The soft rope of a water moccasin slid down the red knees of a mangrove. The hundreds of ribs housed in their smooth white sleeves of muscle moving it like a happiness toward the water, or some bubbles on the surface of that underworld announced a fatal carelessness. I didn't even then move toward the fine point of the story, but stood in my lonely body, amazed and full of attention as it fell, like a stream of glowing syrup into the dark water, as death blurted out that perfectly arranged mouth. The Notebook. And this poem is set in quotation marks. 6 a.m. The small pond turtle lifts its head into the air like a green toe. It looks around. What it sees is the whole world swirling back from darkness, a red sun rising over the water, over the pines, and the wind lifting, and the water striders heading out, and the white lilies opening their happy bodies. The turtle doesn't have a word for any of it, the silky water, or the enormous blue morning, or the curious affair of his own body. On the shore, I'm so busy scribbling and crossing out, I almost miss seeing him paddle away through the wet black forest. More and more the moments come to me. How much can the right word do? Not a few of the lilies are a faint flamingo inside their white hearts, and there is still time to let the last roses of the sunrise float down into my uplifted eyes. Praise. Knee-deep in the ferns springing up at the edge of the whistling swamp, I watch the owl with its satisfied, heart-shaped face as it flies over the water. Back and forth as it flutters down like a hellish moth wherever the reeds twitch. Whenever, in the muddy cover, some little life sighs before it slides into the moonlight and becomes a shadow. In the distance, awful and infallible, the old swamp belches. Of course, it stabs my heart whenever something cries out like a teardrop. But isn't it wonderful what is happening in the branches of the pines? The owls, young, dressed in snowflakes, are starting to fatten. They beat their muscular wings. They dream of flying for another 1,000,000 years over the water, over the ferns, over the world's roughage as it bleeds and deepens. Looking for snakes. Because it is good to be afraid, but not too afraid. I walk carefully up the slabby hill, through laces of bracken, through the thick wild roses, waiting for my heart to fly up out of the leaves, chilled and singing, and it does. They're there, 2 of them, in sleepy loops, and they rise in a spit of energy like dark stalks. Among the wild pink roses, their mouths narrow and stubborn, their red eyes staring. Do you shiver at the mere mention of their glossy, shoulderless bodies? I would like to bring you here. I would like you to remember the black flowers of their faces, as well as their quick slithering. I would like you to remember the pretty fire that dabs out of their mouths, as well as the plunge back into the shadows and the heart's thudding song. Fish bones. Maybe Michelangelo or Picasso could have imagined these dream shapes, these curves and thongs, snow needles, jaws, brain cases, eye sockets. Somebody, anyway, whose mind was in some clear kind of rapture, and probably in the early morning when the sun on its invisible muscle was rising over the water. I don't think it was just a floundering in the darkness, no matter how much time there was. This morning, I picked up something like a honeycombed heart and something else like a frozen flower at the foot of the waves, and I thought of Da Vinci, the way he kept dreaming of what was inside the darkness, how it wanted to rise on its invisible muscle, how it wanted to shine like fire. The oak tree at the entrance to Blackwater Pond. Every day on my way to the pond, I pass the lightning-felled, chesty, 100-fingered black oak, which, summers ago, swam forward when the storm laid one lean yellow wand against it, smoking it open to its rosy heart. It dropped down in a veil of rain, in a cloud of sap and fire, and became what it has been ever since, a black boat floating in the tossing leaves of summer, like the coffin of Osiris descending upon the cloudy Nile. But listen, I'm tired of that brazen promise, death and resurrection. I'm tired of hearing how the nitrogens will return to the earth again through the hinterland of patience, how the mushrooms and the yeast will arrive in the wind, how they'll anchor the pearls of their bodies and begin to gnaw through the darkness like wolves at bones. What I loved, was that tree of the moment, tree of my own sad mortal heart. I don't want to sing any more of the way Osiris came home at last on a clean and powerful ship over the dangerous sea as a tall and beautiful stranger. Everything. No doubt in Holland, when Van Gogh was a boy, there were swans drifting over the green sea of the meadows, and no doubt on some warm afternoon he lay down and watched them and almost thought, this is everything. What drove him to get up and look further is what saves this world, even as it breaks the hearts of men. In the mines where he preached, where he studied tenderness, there were only men, all of them streaked with dust. For years he would reach toward the darkness. But no doubt, like all of us, he finally remembered everything, including the white birds, weightless and unaccountable, floating around the towns of grit and hopelessness, and this is what would finish him. Not the gloom, which was only terrible, but those last yellow fields where clearly nothing in the world mattered or ever would but the insensible light. Nature. All night, in and out the slippery shadows, the owl hunted. The beads of blood scarcely dry on the hooked beak before hunger again seized him, and he fell, snipping the life from some plush breather, and floated away into the crooked branches of the trees that all night went on lapping, the sunken rain and growing, bristling life spreading through all their branches as one by one. They tossed the white moon upward on its slow way to another morning in which nothing new would ever happen, which is the true gift of nature, which is the reason we love it. Forgive me, for hours I had tried to sleep and failed. Restless and wild, I could settle on nothing and fell in envy of the things of darkness following their sleepy course. The root and branch, the bloodied beak, even the screams from the cold leaves were as red songs that rose and fell in their accustomed place. Snake. And here is the serpent again, dragging himself out from his nest of darkness, his cave under the black rocks, his winter death. He slides over the pine needles. He loops around the bunches of rising grass, looking for the sun. Well, who doesn't want the sun after the long winter? I step aside. He feels the air with his soft tongue. Around the bones of his body he moves like oil. Downhill he goes toward the black mirrors of the pond. Last night it was still so cold. I woke and went out to stand in the yard, and there was no moon. So I just stood there inside the jaw of nothing. An owl cried in the distance. I thought of Jesus, how he crouched in the dark for 2 nights, then floated back above the horizon. There are so many stories more beautiful than answers. I follow the snake down to the pond. Thick and musky he is, as circular as hope. The ponds. Every year the lilies are so perfect I can hardly believe their lapped light crowding the black midsummer ponds. Nobody could count all of them. The muskrats swimming among the pads and the grasses can reach out their muscular arms and touch only so many. They are that rife and wild. But what in this world is perfect? I bend closer and see how this one is clearly lopsided, and that one wears an orange blight, and this one is a glossy cheek, half nibbled away, and that one is a slumped purse, full of its own unstoppable decay. Still, what I want in my life is to be willing, to be dazzled, to cast aside the weight of facts, and maybe even to float a little above this difficult world. I want to believe I am looking into the white fire of a great mystery. I want to believe that the imperfections are nothing, that the light is everything, that it is more than the sum of each flawed blossom rising and fading, and I do. The summer day. Who made the world? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper, I mean. The one who has flung herself out of the grass, the one who is eating sugar out of my hand, who is moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down, who is gazing around with her enormous and complicated eyes. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I've been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Serengeti. When he comes walking under the baobab, awash with the sun or flecked with patches of shadows, his curled lip under the long hair as rough as a crib of hay, dappled with black flies, when he comes at night floating along the edges of the water holes, when he snuffles the ground and opens the wet tunnel of his throat and roars, I think of the heavy-browed crouch fishermen, how they stood at dusk at the rim of the cave and listened until it came to them. For the first time, the terror and the awe of the swinging golden foot that waits in the darkness. Can anyone doubt that the lion of Serengeti is part of the idea of God? Can anyone doubt that, for those first almost upright bodies in the shadow of Kilimanjaro, in the lush garden of Africa, in the continuation of everything beyond each individual thing, the lion was both the flower of life and the winch of death, the bone breaker and the agent of transformation? No doubt in the beginning he rose out of the grass like a fire, as now he rises out of the grass like a fire, gleaming and unapproachable, and notices me, and fixes me with his large, almost fatherly eyes, and flexes his shoulders. I don't know anything so beautiful as the sunlight in his rough hair. I don't know where I've seen such power before, except perhaps in the chapel where Michelangelo's God, tawny and muscular, tears the land from the firmament and places the sun in the sky so that we may live on the earth, among the amazements, and the lion runs softly through the dust, and his eyes under the thick animal lashes are almost tender, and I don't know when I have been so frightened or so happy. The terns. The birds shrug off the slant air. They plunge into the sea and vanish under the glassy edges of the water, and then come back, flying out of the waves as white as snow, shaking themselves, shaking the little silver fish, crying out in their own language, voices like rough bells. It's wonderful, and it happens whenever the tide starts its gushing journey back every morning or afternoon. This is a poem about death, about the heart blanching in its fold of shadows because it knows someday it will be the fish and the wave and no longer itself. It will be those white wings flying in and out of the darkness, but not knowing it. This is a poem about loving the world and everything in it, the self, the perpetual muscle, the passage in and out, the bristling swing of the sea. Roses, late summer. What happens to the leaves after they turn red and golden and fall away? What happens to the singing birds when they can't sing any longer? What happens to their quick wings? Do you think there is any personal heaven for any of us? Do you think anyone, the other side of that darkness, will call to us, meaning us? Beyond the trees, the foxes keep teaching their children to live in the valley. So they never seem to vanish. They are always there in the blossom of light that stands up every morning in the dark sky. And over one more set of hills along a sea, the last roses have opened their factories of sweetness and are giving it back to the world. If I had another life, I would want to spend it all on some unstinting happiness. I would be a fox, or a tree full of waving branches. I wouldn't mind being a rose in a field full of roses. Fear has not yet occurred to them, nor ambition, reasons they have not yet thought of. Neither do they ask how long they must be roses and then what, or any other foolish question. Herons in winter in the frozen marsh. All winter, 2 blue herons hunkered in the frozen marsh like 2 columns of blue smoke. What they ate, I can't imagine, unless it was the small laces of snow that settled in the ruckus of the cattails, or the glazed windows of ice under the tired pitchforks of their feet. So the answer is they ate nothing, and nothing good could come of that. They were mired in nature and starving. Still, every morning they shrugged the rime from their shoulders, and all day they stood to attention in the stubbled desolation. I was filled with admiration, sympathy, and of course, empathy. It called for a miracle. Finally, the marsh softened, and their wings cranked open, revealing the old blue light. So that I thought, how could this possibly be the blunt, dark finish? First one, then the other vanished into the ditches and upheavals. All spring I watched the rising blue-green grass above its gleaming and substantial shadows toss in the breeze like wings. Looking at a book of Van Gogh's paintings in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. Don't try to tell me what can or can't be done. The snow is falling again, perfectly at leisure over the gray, thin-haired backs of the mountains of Pennsylvania. I'm far from home, and neither are these trees, olives and almonds, home. Neither is this gathering of sunflowers, this yellow house, home. Don't try to tell me what one poor and lonely Dutchman can or can't do with a brush and a roll of canvas and his crazy old heart. Outside, the snow floats down. It sifts through the crooked branches. It doesn't hesitate. It settles over the ground like the white fire it was in the beginning, wherever it began to pour through the black sky. What a light it becomes anywhere at all. It rubs against this earth, this crazy old home. Foxes in winter. Every night in the moonlight, the foxes come down the hill to gnaw on the bones of birds. I never said nature wasn't cruel. Once, in a city as hot as these woods are cold, I met a boy with a broken face. To stay alive, he was a beggar. Also, in the night, a thief. And there are birds in his country that look like rainbows. If he could have caught them, he would have torn off their feathers and put their bodies into his own. The foxes are hungry. Who could blame them for what they do? I never said we weren't sunk in glittering nature until we are able to become something else. As for the boy, it's simple. He had nothing, not even a bird. All night the pines are so cold their branches crack. All night the snow falls softly down. Then it shines like a field of white flowers. Then it tightens. How turtles come to spend the winter in the aquarium, then are flown south and released back into the sea. Somewhere down beach in the morning at water's edge, I found a sea turtle. Its huge head a smoldering apricot, its shell streaming with seaweed, its eyes closed, its flippers motionless. When I bent down, it moved a little. When I picked it up, it sighed. Was it 40 pounds or 50 pounds or 100? Was it 2 miles back to the car? We walked a little while, and then we rested, and then we walked on. I walked with my mouth open, my heart roared. The eyes opened, I don't know what they thought. Sometimes the flippers swam at the air, sometimes the eyes closed. I couldn't walk anymore, and then I walked some more while it turned into granite or cement, but with that apricot-colored head, that stillness, that Buddha-like patience, that cold shock, but slowly beating heart. Finally, we reached the car. The afternoon is the other part of this story. Have you ever found something beautiful and maybe just in time? How such a challenge can fill you. Jesus could walk over the water. I had to walk ankle deep in the sand, and I did it. My bones didn't quite snap. Come on in and see me smile. I probably won't stop for hours. Already in the warmth, the turtle has raised its head, is looking around. Today, who could deny it? I am an important person. Crows. It is January, and there are the crows, like black flowers on the snow. While I watch, they rise and float toward the frozen pond. They have seen some streak of death on the dark ice. They gather around it and consume everything, the strings and the red music of that nameless body. Then they shout, one hungry, blunt voice echoing another. It begins to rain. Later, it becomes February, and even later, spring returns, a chorus of thousands. They bow and begin their important music. I recognize the oriole. I recognize the thrush and the mockingbird. I recognize the business of summer, which is to forge ahead delicately. So I dip my fingers among the green stems delicately. I lounge at the edge of the leafing pond delicately. I scarcely remember the crust of the snow. I scarcely remember the icy dawns and the sun like a lamp without a fuse. I don't remember the fury of loneliness. I never felt the wind's drift. I never heard of the struggle between anything and nothing. I never saw the flapping, blood-gulping crows. Maybe. Sweet Jesus, talking his melancholy madness, stood up in the boat, and the sea lay down, silky and sorry. So everybody was saved that night. But you know how it is when something different crosses the threshold. The uncles mutter together. The women walk away. The young brother begins to sharpen his knife. Nobody knows what the soul is. It comes and goes like the wind over the water. Sometimes for days you don't think of it. Maybe after the sermon, after the multitude was fed, one or two of them felt the soul slip forth, like a tremor of pure sunlight before exhaustion that wants to swallow everything, gripped their bones and left them miserable and sleepy as they are now, forgetting how the wind tore at the sails before he rose and talked to it, tender and luminous and demanding as he always was, 1,000 times more frightening than the killer sea. Finches. Ice in the woods, snow in the fields, a few finches singing. I look up in time to see their raspberry-colored faces and the black tears on their breasts. Of course they are just trying to stay alive, like the frozen river and the crows. But who would guess that, the way they dangle the bright necklaces of their music from the tops of the trees? Before nightfall, they'd better find where the last sprays of seeds have fallen. They'd better find shelter from the wind. And there they go, tiny rosettes of energy, as though nothing in this world was frightening, as though the only thing that mattered was to praise the world sufficiently, as though they were only looking light-heartedly for the next tree in which to sing. And here I am at home again, out of the snowy fields where I will take off my jacket and sit down at the table and go over my verses again. White owl flies into and out of the field. Coming down out of the freezing sky with its depths of light, like an angel or a Buddha with wings, it was beautiful and accurate, striking the snow and whatever was there with a force that left the imprint of the tips of its wings, 5 feet apart, and the grabbing thrust of its feet, and the indentation of what had been running through the white valleys of the snow. And then it rose gracefully and flew back to the frozen marshes to lurk there, like a little lighthouse in the blue shadows. So I thought, maybe death isn't darkness after all, but so much light wrapping itself around us, as soft as feathers that we are instantly weary of looking and shut our eyes, not without amazement, and let ourselves be carried as through the translucence of mica to the river, that is without the least dapple or shadow, that is nothing but light, scalding, aortal light, in which we are washed and washed out of our bones. And that's it. That is Mary Oliver's book of poems, House of Light.